welcome to the Scholar Series, the Amram Scholar Series. I'm going to highlight, she doesn't want to be called on, but I just want to give a public thank you to Leslie Maitland, who has made 2021 for me one of the most interesting years. Every time I tell her, she picks the best book, and then it's been topped by the next book that she had picked and the author that she has picked. And Leslie just did an outstanding job. I'm going to ask, maybe she doesn't want to be called on, but I'm going to pin her just for a second to give her a thank you. Leslie, I just want to, I think, did I add her in? Let's see. Now I can't see where I am. I just want to thank you, Leslie, an outstanding job. And we do that. And Leslie's already thinking about some incredible people for the fall, but we just want to thank you for all that you've done in highlighting and giving us an opportunity. And that takes us to our speaker today, which is Debbie Cenziper, is a journalist by profession. And we begin with, in her book, she notes that Ned Stutman, who I had the privilege of meeting once and who happens to be Shira Stutman's father, was a prosecutor, said, scrolling across his screen, she writes in her book, is the word tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. This scrolled across the screen of Ned Stutman, a lead prosecutor from OSI, and this also must run through the soul of our author today. She is a journalist by profession, but an incredible and powerful storyteller by nature. Her book, Citizen 865, is brilliant, powerful, and gives us an in-depth story of the story behind the infamous trials of Jack Reimer. This is, I want to tell you, if you haven't read this book, and I'm going to just warn you, you cannot pick up this book and then put it down again. It is a fabulous piece, and Debbie, you should be really commended on what you've done. Debbie joins the Washington Post in staff in 2007 after spending 15 years at the Miami Herald and the Charlotte Observer. She received the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for local reporting for her year-long investigation of housing corruption in Miami, which led to convictions of several developers and federal takeover of county housing agency. In 2006, Debbie was named a Pulitzer finalist in exploratory reporting for a series exposing breakdown in the nation's hurricane warning system. At the Post, she has reported on local and national and local nonprofit groups that failed to provide services for people with AIDS, the U.S. Department of Housing, and the Urban Development's Trouble Housing Construction Program for the Poor, which led to changes in the federal law. Left with nothing about this, district's flawed tax lien program was awarded the 2014 Robert F. Kennedy Award. She had told me that she worked on this particular book for a number of years. It is a fabulous piece. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist doing investigative reporting and teaching and directing the Northwestern University program. And we're delighted to have her today. The book that she has is Citizen 865, grew out of the discovery of the 1945 Nazi roster in 1990 by two American historians. This is an incredible book. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Debbie, because I could go on with other accolades, but I don't want to give away the thriller. So thank you so much for joining us and joining our Scholar Series today.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me. And thank you for that introduction. Yes, I wish my mother was on this call because she definitely enjoyed that introduction. But thank you very much, everyone, for having me. I always love speaking to audiences in the Washington, D.C. area because clearly there are so many ties to the D.C. region in this book. You know, as the rabbi said, I've been an investigative reporter now for almost my entire professional career. I'm going to age myself, but it's 25 plus years as an investigative reporter. And really, you know, I was writing about, I would say, the worst in human nature. People that were corrupt and greedy and did bad things to very vulnerable people. And in writing this book, this nonfiction book about the men and women who chased Nazi perpetrators in the United States for years, I was really able to do something different, which was write about the best in human nature, write a book that I wanted my boys to read, not only because I wanted them to understand the history of this unit and of the Trawniki training camp, which is what the book is about, but I also wanted them to know about the people who made it their life's work to pursue justice. And I say at the beginning of this book, this is a story about darkness, but also about light. And I really felt, as a human being, as a journalist, as a Jewish woman, as a wife, and as a mom, really moved and inspired and hopeful by the time I got to the end of my own journey in reporting and researching Citizen 865. So this book actually got started in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. I was at a New Year's Eve party with my husband, and in the final moments of 2017, I fell into a conversation at this party with a prosecutor who worked inside the Justice Department. And she started telling me about this Nazi hunting unit deep inside the very powerful criminal division of the Justice Department, and about the unit's work over the years. And though I had lived and worked in Washington for more than a decade by then, I really didn't know much about this unit. And I remember asking myself two things that night. First, how was it even possible that we were still finding Nazi war criminals on US soil in 2017, so many decades after the end of the war? I just had a hard time believing that we were still identifying these men, essentially hiding in plain sight in American cities and suburbs. And I also really wanted to know more about the prosecutors and historians inside this unit, who had really set aside their own self-interest, higher paying jobs, less stressful jobs, to pursue these mass murderers and collaborators. How were they able, year after year, to not only interview Holocaust survivors and witnesses, but also the mass murderers themselves? How were they able to separate their professional lives from their private lives and go home at night to their husbands and their wives and their children and all the things we go home to at night? How are they able to compartmentalize like that, to probe some of the darkest moments in history, and then, go home at night and hug their kids? I just wanted to understand the people that did this work on a more personal level. So in the first few weeks of 2018, I called an historian who is now at the U.S. Holocaust Museum here in D.C. Her name is Elizabeth White, or Elizabeth Barry White. And Barry started telling me about a trip that she and a couple of other historians took to Prague in 1990, to the archives of Prague. And this was a really important trip because for many, many decades after the end of the war, communist governments in cities like Kiev and Moscow and Warsaw really did not want Western investigators there. They really didn't want to give Western investigators open access to the archives in communist countries. And so Barry knew that the Nazis, and perhaps even the Soviets, had stashed rosters and records in some of these cities in the final months of the war, but no one from the West could ever get there to see what was there. And so suddenly in 1990, communism was collapsing, the wall had fallen, and they received inside the Justice Department this coveted invitation from the government in Prague to come look at the archives to see what secrets might be contained inside the archives in Prague. And so Barry and a few other historians flew to Prague. They arrived in their rental apartment in the middle of the night. They had a Soviet caretaker there who absolutely insisted on serving pork cutlets and beer for breakfast. Now, this did not sound good to poor Barry White because she was 3 months pregnant at the time, suffering from morning sickness, absolutely not appetizing. And one morning, a government sedan showed up, and Barry White and her colleague Peter, another historian, were taken to the archives. And they were shown inside this vast room surrounded by armed Czech security agents. And through an interpreter, Peter said, "My name is Peter Black, and this is Barry White, and we're here representing the US Department of Justice." Now, of course, all of the armed Czech security agents started snickering under their breath because they're thinking, Peter Black, Barry White, the CIA has no imagination. They must be spies. Only the CIA would assign such silly names to spies. But of course, they weren't spies. They really were historians from the Justice Department there to discover whatever they might find. And so they were shown inside the drafty basement archives. And poor Barry White, not feeling well, every hour on the hour, ran to the bathroom, which was in an elevator air shaft with a chain that flushed the toilet. But she powered through, as women do. And a few hours into her search, she pushed back her chair. She ran over to her colleague, Peter Black, with a folder, and she said, "I think I found something." And what Barry White found in the archives of Prague in 1990, more than 4 decades after the end of the war, was a Nazi roster from 1945 that listed the names of 700 men who had served for the duration of the war at an obscure Nazi training camp in a small Polish village called Trawniki. And Peter and Barry knew from their research that the men of the Trawniki camp helped the SS liquidate the Jewish ghettos of occupied Poland. And they had helped the SS staff the extermination camps of occupied Poland. But they really didn't know much about how the camp operated, what this camp meant to the Nazi operation in occupied Poland. And they really didn't know if any of those men, or many of those men, were living on US soil. And so now they're scanning the names and they recognize some of the names. The reason they recognize them is because they had suspected for years that these men had served some role during the war in the Nazi regime in occupied Poland, but they didn't have the proof. And suddenly now they had this document that not only listed their names, but their dog tag numbers, their Nazi issued identification numbers, and other identifying information. And that single find in Prague in 1990, 45 years after the end of the war or so, 45 years after the end of the war, led this Nazi hunting unit known as the Office of Special Investigations on a 15-year investigation into the men of the Trawniki training camp. And what's more, it also helped the prosecutors and historians inside this unit identify more than a dozen Trawniki men who were hiding in plain sight in American cities and suburbs, from New York City to Cleveland to Chicago. It became one of many operations inside this unit, but it was one that I was particularly intrigued by because I had never heard of Trawniki. And the reason that I had never heard of it, and most of us had never heard of it, is because the records were buried for years in the archives of communist countries. Am I able to share my screen? I apologize for not asking about that in advance. Yes, I am. Terrific. I'd love to give you all just a little bit of background on the Trawniki training camp, if I may. Trawniki, if you can see here, is a tiny Polish village south of Warsaw. And in the early months of the war, it became an incredibly strategic location for the SS in occupied Poland because Trawniki had a rail lines.
Debbie, if you'll go to slide view, you'll be able to fill the screen. There you go.
Sorry. Rail lines here, you can see from Trawniki, that connected this little nothing farming village to Jewish hubs all across occupied Poland. And in the early months of the war, the SS needed manpower to do what they wanted to do in occupied Poland, which was to annihilate the Jews of Poland. And they couldn't turn to young German boys because they were busy fighting on the Soviet front. And they also, in some ways, wanted to spare young German boys from the grueling work of mass murder. And so the SS did something really rather strategic. They started recruiting from the civilian population in Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia. They also started recruiting captured Soviet soldiers, men that they had been fighting against. They plucked out of POW camps, brought them to this Trawniki training camp, and essentially converted their enemies into loyal foot soldiers. Because in this town of Trawniki, 5,000 so-called Trawniki men were given food, barracks, uniforms. They were given training. The camp had loudspeakers that blasted Nazi ideology. There were reports that these men were asked to, quote, shoot a Jew to prove their loyalty to the Nazi cause. They were given service medals, paid vacations, and insurance. By wartime standards, it wasn't such a bad life. And so these 5,000 men from all walks of life that spoke many different languages and from many different countries became a cohesive killing force, trained at what was, for all intents and purposes, a Nazi-run school for mass murder in Trawniki. And so their very first assignment in March of 1942 was just about 40 kilometers north or so to the town of Lublin. And before the war, Lublin was a hub for Jewish life. 40,000 Jews lived in Lublin. They owned factories, they served on town council. Some had children who spoke Polish, they were somewhat assimilated. And they were, of course, forced into the Lublin Ghetto. And there they stayed for quite a while. I remember in the reporting of this book, walking the old cobblestone streets of the ghetto. And, there was just a wall, of old houses that was the exterior wall. And every weekend, just outside the ghetto, Polish farmers would set up a farmer's market and bring their bread and fruit and vegetables and meat. And I remember thinking as I walked the cobblestone streets of this ghetto, what it must have been like for the parents and grandparents to not be able to feed their children and know that food was just outside the walls. It was really a devastating thought that I come back to very often. But they managed to survive the Warsaw Ghetto. The conditions there were much more horrific. Though things were dire, they managed to survive in this Lublin Ghetto for quite some time until one night in March of 1942, 5,000 or so Trawniki men were sent to the ghetto on their first mission. They surrounded the perimeter of the ghetto at night. They lighted the street lamps and they called everyone outside. And then they announced that 1,500 Jews a day would be taken away and resettled in the East. Now, we know now that the term resettled is Nazi code for murder because, of course, the Jews of Lublin were taken to the first extermination center to open in occupied Poland. I call it an extermination camp because there were no barracks there. Jews were not able to serve, in most cases, as forced laborers. They were taken right off the trains and sent to their deaths in the gas chambers. And so that is what happened with the help of the Trawniki men in the Lublin Ghetto, fighting side by side with the SS and the German police to liquidate the ghetto one street at a time for several weeks. The sick and the elderly were shot on the spot. The Trawniki men went to the Jewish hospital. They shot the doctors, the nurses, and the patients. They went to the Jewish orphanage. They shot the children as well as their caregivers. It was a brutal, bloody, horrific operation. And from Lublin, the Trawniki men were deployed all across occupied Poland to help liquidate other Jewish ghettos and also to staff, to man the perimeters of the extermination camps, and in some cases to occupy to operate the gas chambers. Trawniki men were also sent to the Warsaw Ghetto, where they fought side by side with the Germans to suppress the Jewish uprising, killing Jews on the spot, and everybody else was shipped, most everybody else was shipped off to their deaths. This is a very famous and hard to look at picture of Trawniki men standing over the bodies of the dead in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Jews at the time didn't know who these men were. They often called them the Ukrainians because some of them had Ukrainian accents, but they said that they were more brutal than the dreaded SS, the Ukrainians, more brutal than the dreaded SS, which really makes sense because these were mostly young men from Eastern European countries where there was anti-Semitism and this hatred that dated back generations. They were mostly uneducated, young, and suddenly they had this mission, and the hatred ran deep. And so that these men were so essential to the Nazi operation in occupied Poland that on many days there were more Trawniki men operating the death camps than the SS. These men did the bloodiest jobs in occupied Poland, and they did it with great skill and great enthusiasm. Without the men of Trawniki, there is no way the SS could have murdered 1.7 million Jews in fewer than 20 months. That is the span of 2 Polish summers. And that was the bloodiest stretch of the war in occupied Poland when the Nazis were executing an operation known as Operation Reinhard, which is the execution of the Jews of Poland. And that is when the death camps in occupied Poland were operational. So these men were an absolutely essential killing force. This is a picture that always boggles my mind. You can see the Trawniki men here at the Belzec extermination camp. One young man is playing the mandolin. But they were young, they were eager, and they were an incredible killing force. And so in my research, I listened to the oral histories of many, many survivors, one more extraordinary than the next, just stunning stories, as you all know. But I really was fascinated by the survival story of this young woman here, Lucy, and her 5-year-old brother, David. And Lucy lived in Lublin, and during the liquidation of the ghetto in 1942, Lucy and her 19-year-old friend Feliks hid inside a double wall that Feliks's father carved in the wall. His father was an architect. And they survived that liquidation, but they watched their parents, grandparents, everyone they ever knew march to their deaths. In fact, from inside a building, Feliks peered through a hole in the wall and watched his parents and sister march through the snow to their deaths. But they survived, and they made their way, 16-year-old Lucy, 19-year-old Feliks, and her 5-year-old brother David, to the Warsaw Ghetto, where Lucy had an uncle. And they slipped inside the ghetto because where else do you go in occupied Poland when you're 2 Jews on the run from the Nazis? They didn't know. So inside the ghetto, Lucy's uncle takes one look at them and says, "You're traveling together, you're a young woman, young man, you must be married." And Lucy said, I like Feliks. I don't want to marry Feliks. I'm an orphan. I just lost my parents. The uncle insisted, no, you must be married. And so under the cover of night in the Warsaw Ghetto, Lucy and Feliks married at 16 and 19. And after the ceremony, a woman came up to Lucy, pulled the wedding ring off of her own finger, pressed it in Lucy's palm and said, "Here, you take it. Maybe it will bring you better luck." And in some ways it did, because just before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Lucy, Feliks, and Lucy's younger brother, David, managed to escape the ghetto with the help of the Polish underground. And they lived for a time hiding in plain sight in Warsaw. I'll let you read the book to find out what happened and what happened to 5-year-old David, who did not survive the war. But Lucy and Feliks did survive. They ended the war in a little village near Krakow, hiding as Jews, Feliks volunteering to teach arithmetic to Polish children who hadn't been to school since the start of the war. And one day, Feliks heard the rumbling of Soviet tank engines approach the village. That was liberation. And the next morning, a commander walked into the village, looked at Feliks, and he said, "Who are you?" And Feliks said, I'm the teacher here. And for the first time in many, many months, he said, and I'm also a Jew. And the commander said, you can't be a Jew. All the Jews are dead. No, no, Feliks said, I really am a Jew. So the Soviet commander calls over another Soviet soldier who happened to be Jewish. And he turns to the soldier and he says, you're a Jew. He says he's a Jew. Speak Yiddish to each other. Now, poor Feliks did not know a word of Yiddish. He really came from a very assimilated family in Lublin. In fact, his father used to call in the rabbi to their home to teach Feliks some prayers and some history. And when the rabbi nodded off at the kitchen table, Feliks would flip through the pages of his prayer book so that when the rabbi woke up, he would say, look, Rabbi, I'm a good boy. I finished all my prayers. And so now he's facing this Soviet Jewish soldier. He's orphaned. He's hungry. He's been sick for many months. He's terrified. He's sad. And somewhere from the depths of his soul, he happened to remember a single prayer. And it was the Shema, the holiest prayer in the Jewish religion. And so he recited the Shema. The Soviet soldier hugged him and said, wow, you really are a Jew. And that's how Feliks and Lucy ended the war. They walked through the snow 80 kilometers back to Lublin to see if anyone had survived, and a cousin, an aunt, someone. And of 40,000 Jews who lived in Lublin before the war, fewer than 200 survived. Feliks and Lucy were among them. And so they ended up leaving Poland. They did not want to stay there. They went to Vienna. Feliks got his medical degree. And then a distant uncle in New York City sent for them, and they were able to get a visa to come to the United States. And so in the early 1950s, they crossed the ocean, came to New York City. Feliks did his medical residency in Rochester, New York. They ended up moving to the Midwest to start their family. And what Lucy and Feliks never knew was that the very same men from Trawniki who had liquidated the Lublin Ghetto, who had had a hand in the murders of everyone they ever knew and loved, who had followed them to the Warsaw Ghetto to fight side by side with the German police and the SS, and then who fanned out across occupied Poland to finish up the job at all of the other Jewish ghettos and the death camps, had in fact received some of the same visas that Feliks and Lucy and other survivors were able to receive, those coveted visas, and had come over on the same ships and had settled in the United States in America's cities and suburbs. And that suddenly Jewish survivors and their children and World War II veterans were now living alongside Nazi murderers and collaborators. And these men from Trawniki were able to do it because they lied about their identities. They ditched their paperwork and their Nazi uniforms. They lied on their visa applications, and they slipped into the United States. And in the case of Trawniki, nobody here in the West knew anything about this camp for years. And so Army intelligence didn't know what clues to pick up on, even if Trawniki was mentioned on a visa application. They had no idea what had happened at Trawniki or how essential these men were in the Nazi operation in occupied Poland. And years later, Feliks turned to his grown son and he opened up the newspaper and saw a story about OSI, this Nazi hunting unit, about Nazis in the United States. And he said to his son, how is this possible? His son had no good answer. And so in 1979, a young Jewish congresswoman from Brooklyn, New York, named Elizabeth Holtzman, heard that there were Nazi war criminals living in the United States. Before that, the Nazi hunting operation had been run haphazardly, not with much enthusiasm by INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services. Not much success, not much luck. But in 1979, Elizabeth Holtzman called for congressional hearings, and she absolutely insisted that a dedicated Nazi hunting unit form inside the Justice Department's powerful criminal division. And the reason she was so adamant is because Simon Wiesenthal called in a tip from Israel around that time, or a couple of years earlier, because he had heard that there was a housewife living in Queens, New York, who during the war had served as a commandant at the Majdanek concentration camp in occupied Poland. And she had earned this nickname of the Stomping Mare because she used the soles of her jackboots to brutalize children. She married an American GI after the war and settled into a nice quiet life in Queens, New York, until Simon Wiesenthal called in a tip to the Justice Department. And Elizabeth Holtzman, this young congresswoman, was so outraged and so surprised that she insisted that the Justice Department take a really good look at who's here, who's living in the United States. And so everyone thought this Nazi hunting unit known as OSI would only be around for a couple of years. After all, how many Nazi war criminals could we expect to find in the United States in 1980 and 1985, decades after the end of the war? But this unit went on doing its work for more than 30 years and is now widely considered one of the most, if not the most successful Nazi hunting units in the world. They couldn't take suspected Nazi war criminals to criminal court. They were very limited because the US Constitution does not allow prosecutors or the federal government to prosecute in criminal court people who committed crimes on foreign soil against non-US citizens. Very limited, they were very limited. But in civil court, they could bring these men before judges and try to convince a judge to strip them of their US citizenship. Since so many Nazi perpetrators came to the United States and ultimately became naturalized citizens, pledging before the Constitution to defend the United States. So OSI could take these men, and in a handful of cases, women, to civil court and try to convince a judge to order them denaturalized. Then they could take them to an immigration court and try to convince an immigration judge to order these men deported, sent off, so that they didn't die in the United States in peace alongside survivors. They just, I asked myself as I was starting this book, what motivated OSI, the people inside OSI? Was it revenge? Was it retribution? We see these, Nazi hunting movies with excitement and guns and holsters and, kind of an Amazon drama kind of a thing. But that's really not what motivated the men and women inside this unit. It really was for them about taking back something that these men should never have received in the first place, a visa, which could have gone to another Jewish survivor or a war refugee. They lied about their whereabouts during the war, and they should never, ever have been allowed to come here. And I also think they were motivated by this idea of wanting to send a message to the rest of the world that the US will never provide refuge to war criminals, that this will never be home to anyone who contributes to genocide. And I also think for the historians inside this unit, it was about correcting the record of history when it came to Trawniki. It was really about figuring out what Trawniki was and how critical it was to the Nazi operation in occupied Poland. And now Peter Black, that historian who went with Barry White to Prague, is now the world's foremost expert on the Trawniki training camp. He has collected biographical information on nearly all of the 5,000 men who served there. So it was really about all those things, much more so than this idea of revenge. But this unit over the years faced a number of challenges. Here on our soil, conservative commentators like Pat Buchanan and others really didn't want to see this unit around. They constantly called to close the unit. Let bygones be bygones. These men were young at the time. What is this, revenge? But this unit also faced great resistance time and again from Austria and Germany because they did not want to take back Nazi war criminals found in the United States. They were just done with it. And even if an immigration judge here in the US orders someone removed, you can't force another country to take them back. So that meant that they were living in a legal limbo. They were essentially stateless men, but they were still on US soil. And that, I think, became the greatest frustration for this unit over time. In fact, Eli Rosenbaum, the long-serving director of this unit, who is still with the Justice Department, I think he's considered, the most successful, if not one of the most successful Nazi hunters in the world, told me he would want to climb on the top of the Justice Department, the roof, grab a megaphone and shout, "Can you believe the Germans won't take their Nazis back?" But that happened time and time again. And so that, I think, was the most enduring frustration. There was a young prosecutor inside this unit who got word in 1988 that, I'm flipping through quickly, that the Austrians had agreed in 88 to take back some Austrian-born Nazi war criminals here in the United States. This was a big deal for this unit. Finally, Austria was relenting. And so Michael Bernstein, who lived in Bethesda, had a wife and 2 young children, was such a skilled negotiator that Michael said, "Yeah, I'll go to Austria to make sure that the deal is done." And so just before Hanukkah in 88, he flew to Vienna. He managed, he got the deal done. He got this, a signed agreement from the Austrian government that Austria would take back Nazi defendants found in the United States. And he wanted to get home in time to celebrate Hanukkah with his wife and his 4-year-old son and 7-year-old daughter. And so he switched to an earlier flight, and he tragically chose Pan Am Flight 103, which, as you all know, was blown up in the sky over Lockerbie, Scotland by a terrorist bomb. And so some 50 or so years after the end of the war, Michael Bernstein died in the line of duty, trying to get, the Austrians to do the right thing. And Eli Rosenbaum, this longtime director of OSI, still keeps a picture of Michael in his office because it was just the tragic early death of someone, who should not have died. But this unit, as I said, faced such uphill battles. They had to convince judges, American judges, several generations removed from the war, to strip older people, elderly people of their citizenship, and then, send them packing, essentially. This is Jakob Reimer. This is Citizen 865. I named the book after Jakob Reimer. Citizen 865 was his Nazi-issued dog tag number. And I chose to focus on Mr. Reimer because he was the most trusted Trawniki man found on US soil. He led a platoon of men to the Lublin Ghetto, where Feliks and Lucy were from. He led a platoon of men to the Warsaw Ghetto to fight the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto during the Uprising. He was a most loyal foot soldier. In fact, after the war, he stayed on until the very end, thinking he would end up in Nazi Germany, in this Nazi utopia after the war, as a decorated war hero. He had received 4 service medals and paid vacations. And he actually, at the very end of the war, when he realized he needed to run, ditched his uniform, ditched his identification papers, and ended up in Munich. He got a job at the American Red Cross, chauffeuring American GIs to Hollywood movies at night. And then, on the recommendation of a Red Cross supervisor who said he would make a most loyal American, he received a visa and was able to come to the United States 1 year after Feliks and Lucy came to the United States. He settled in New York City. He became a wise potato chip franchise owner, and then retired along the shoreline of Lake Carmel with an American wife and American sons, and a pension and a Social Security card, and a nice life, until OSI found his name. Barry White and Peter Black found his name on that Nazi roster from 1945. And they realized that this man that they suspected of taking part in the Nazi operation in occupied Poland was in fact a pretty critical part of the operation. George Will, the conservative commentator, covered Jakob Reimer's trial in 1992 in New York, and he wrote that the Trawniki men were cogs in a wheel. They weren't the high-level guys, men that were captured in South America. or tried at Nuremberg, but they were mid-level collaborators, and that every cog in a wheel must be brought to justice. But that was a hard thing for this unit to do, because this is what Jakob Reimer looked like in 1992 when he stood before a judge and he said, I didn't do anything that I only did what I was asked to do, and I was young. I've lived here for more than 50 years. I've never had a traffic ticket. And so the judge in Mr. Reimer's case waited 4 years before stripping him of his citizenship. And by then, Mr. Reimer was an elderly man. The Germans refused to take him back, and he was able to die here in the United States in 2005 in Pennsylvania. One of about 8, I think, OSI defendants who were able to die in the United States because no country would take them back. But this unit over time was able to track and investigate and ultimately deport many, many Nazi war criminals, not just the men of Trawniki. This was just a small component of this operation. But as I said in the beginning, it's the one I was most fascinated with, because the history lived inside the minds of Peter Black and Barry White. There was no mainstream book about it. And I really wanted, as a journalist and as a Jewish woman, to share this story with mainstream audiences. And so I said to you at the beginning that I wrote in the book that it's a story about darkness, but also about light. And if I may, I'll end with this picture of Feliks and Lucy. I've never met them. I wish I met them. I listened to their oral histories one night until 2 a.m. My husband and kids were asleep. I could not leave my desk until I heard how their story ended. They're just such compelling people. And interestingly enough, I've since become friends with their children and grandchildren. But Feliks lived until I think he was 92. He died in his armchair watching an ice hockey game. And Lucy turned to her son at the time and said, I won't live 6 more months without him. And, it made so much sense to me hearing her son share that story, because the only person that remembered Feliks's sister was Lucy. And the only person that remembered Lucy's parents and her 5-year-old brother was Feliks. And so they had this powerful pull of shared memories. In fact, in the middle of the night, Feliks would say to Lucy in Polish, I can't remember what my sister's voice sounded like. And Lucy was there to remind him. And true to her word, she was such a headstrong woman. She died 6 months later on what would have been their 75th wedding anniversary in the Warsaw Ghetto, and left behind this beautiful legacy of children and grandchildren who I've come to know. In fact, I'll say this because we have a rabbi on the line, but her rabbi would often say to them, or would say during services, God giveth and then God taketh away. And Lucy would go up to the rabbi and say, in my life, it was just the opposite. God taketh away and then God giveth. And, every survivor story is exceptional and extraordinary. There was just something about them and about the fact that they outran not only the SS, but the men of Trawniki, and only later found that some of those men were here, was a horrific thought. But, I dedicated this book to my boys, to my 2 college-age sons, because, I wanted them to know that there were people out there, historians and prosecutors, who were absolutely determined to be sure that the right thing happened, and who believed to their core that the passage of time will never excuse mass murder, and that the United States will never provide safe refuge for people who participate in genocide from World War II to beyond, to the present day. And in fact, OSI went on for more than 30 years, but a few years ago merged with another unit inside the Justice Department. Eli Rosenbaum is still there. And now they are looking for war criminals from other hotspots around the world, Bosnia and Guatemala and other places. But every once in a while, they're still finding Nazi war criminals in the United States. They just deported a few months ago a Nazi war criminal found in the state of Tennessee, if you can believe it. So the work goes on. Whether there'll be more cases, I have no idea. But the mission behind this unit is still very much alive and well. Thank you all for having me. Happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna, Debbie, the book is just fascinating, and you're a very, as everybody can see, a very cogent and incredible storyteller. One of the things that I found most interesting, I'd love for you to comment on, is that OSI, when as it's mostly is presented in some way, the heroes are often seen as these, incredible litigators who gave their life to do this. But really the story is it was the first time that there's a merging between, if you will, justice and history. And if you'll just talk a little bit about that, because the historians played an incredible role. And it was not only, was it, in elucidating what certain things are, but giving context, and often were the ones who really discovered the pieces that made the puzzle all fit together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm so glad you asked that. The work couldn't have been done without both groups of people. And Eli Rosenbaum will say that he's, the longest serving director of this unit. The historians were able to put history in context and to tease out lies in statements, right? And in depositions and interviews. And what I learned in my research is that it's not enough to know what happened between 1939 and 1945. You have to understand the whole thing, years earlier, years later. And that's what historians brought to this table. And early on, the Justice Department realized that they couldn't do it with, gun and badge investigators, that they really needed World War II historians to be able to understand context, because history is context. And so they were able to team up with prosecutors, the best prosecutors like Ned Stutman, who you mentioned at the beginning, always brought historians with him to depositions and interviews. They needed the historians because the historians could spot lies. And so I was personally drawn to the historians because I think as an investigative reporter, I just love the idea of digging through documents until you find something. And that's what the historians were able to do. After 1990, they went all over Eastern Europe for weeks on end, pulling up Nazi rosters and records from the archives of Eastern Europe. And I was just fascinated on a personal level by their mission and by their work. But I'll tell you, interviewing prosecutors, which I've done my whole career, is not a hard thing to do because they're storytellers by nature and they know just what to say and how to make something compelling. Interviewing historians is a little bit more challenging because they stick to the facts. What happened on this date at this time? And I was always saying to Peter, but how did that make you feel, Peter? But how did that make you feel? It took a little bit of time to get some of that stuff.
Well, you do a beautiful job. And I think what is most fascinating is that as an investigative reporter, you give us, as the historians gave the backstory to what happened in context, you give the backstory often to what went on. And even the fact that you include Michael Bernstein in, and I kept thinking his name was Josh, but that's another person in my life. It's so powerful that you tell the story about, whether it's an autistic child, whether it's that you make these very real, and you also deal, which I imagine cathartically for yourself, and you speak about a little bit of this, is that, what it was like to go home at night as a prosecutor or as a historian who is, steeped every day in the most horrible of horrible things, even if it's for the most noble cause.
Yeah, it's one thing to interview a survivor or a witness. That's tough. It's another thing to interview a mass murderer who describes mass murder in very clinical terms. It's cold and it's chilling and it's horrifying to listen to. And that's what they listen to, not just month after month, but year after year. I mean, Jakob Reimer, under questioning by Eli Rosenbaum, admitted to shooting at a man. It was one of the first confessions they ever got at OSI. And he admitted to shooting at a man in the woods at a shooting operation near Trawniki, where men, women, and children were brought by truck inside the woods. There was a ravine there, and their bodies were, dumped in the ravine. But one man survived this shooting, and he was pointing to his head, almost as if he were begging for mercy. Just shoot me, take me out of my misery. And Eli got that whole description from Reimer, and I'll tell you, he's never been able to forget it. Never been able to forget it.
I'm going to turn, if there are questions, you can put them in the chat, or I'm going to go to gallery view. You can use the little piece to raise your hand. It is, if you haven't read this book, it's incredibly fascinating. Dr. Gary London is holding up his Northwestern banner just to give praise to Northwestern and their great journalism. If people have questions, please put them in there, and Shira will help me if I don't see them. What in doing this book, Debbie, what touched you the most or became the most fascinating thing of what you learned from this book?
It was interesting to me, just from purely like a military standpoint, how they were able to take a whole bunch of young boys from so many different walks of life and turn them into a cohesive killing force, like incredibly successful military operation. But the one thing I've thought most about, and I've asked people about this, the historians, for example, I've asked about this, is that there were so many collaborators who were never brought to justice, hundreds of thousands of people. And really what haunts me at night is that genocide doesn't start with one person, and it doesn't start with one moment in time. It takes an entire organization to do what the Nazis did. And the fact that, and that's where the Trawniki men fit in. They were mid-level collaborators. And the fact that there are still so many people who went on to live their lives in peace, never questioned, never caught, certainly in Europe, but possibly here, that's something that I still think about, 18 months after this book published. It is an intolerable thought. So
there are two things. One, somebody just noted that attorney Ramsey Clark just died this weekend, who was the one who in the book represented Jack Reimer. And then there was a question from Deborah Wolf that asked about, was this information, did it have to be declassified?
Some of it is still classified. I was lucky enough in that Peter Black retired a few years ago, although he's still a consultant, because everybody turns to Peter because he just knows everything. But Peter donated his life's work, all of his records, to the Holocaust Museum. And so I was able to dig through, 30 boxes of his records. I spent hours and hours in the archives of the Holocaust Museum. So that really helped. And then, of course, I had transcripts of depositions, transcripts of trials, and the people inside this unit who are now retired and some who are still there were so incredibly generous with their time. I mean, I've probably spent, honestly, 100+ hours talking to Peter and Barry alone. So that's how I was able to do this.
Other questions that, there's a question, any sense that these men lived in fear, I guess, of discovery over the many years in the USA?
I don't know, and it's hard to generalize. I can tell you Reimer thought he was going to get away with it. He had been questioned before 1990, and nobody caught him in anything. They suspected, they couldn't quite get it. So when he showed up for questioning after 1990, when they found that roster, he didn't even bring a lawyer. I mean, he showed up, he was affable. Eli Rosenbaum said he looked like he could be a babysitter. I've heard his voice. I have a tape of his confession. He sounds like, an older man, he was a fitness buff and he made a good living for himself. And I just don't think he thought he was going to be caught. So I don't know how he felt and whether or not he lived in fear, but they got away with it for a very long time. And I would imagine that with every passing year, there's that distance, and that maybe you don't feel so worried 50 years later.
So there's a question, was there any indication of coercion, or did these men all volunteer? And how many were actually successfully deported to their country of birth, or really to any country?
Yeah, so there were 5,000 Trawniki men. They were all recruited. The Soviet POWs probably faced certain death in Soviet POW camps. So if they have a chance to get out of a POW camp, that's what they did. So I can't imagine that there was coercion there. There were a handful of men who were brought to Trawniki and deserted the unit. They didn't want to take part in it, but most stayed on until the very end, including Jack Reimer. As I said, he received 4 service medals. He was allowed to go home to see his sister unescorted, and then came back on his own. So as I said, it really wasn't a bad life by wartime standards. So I don't think there was too much coercion. There were 16 Trawniki men in total found on US soil. Some were found before the Office of Special Investigations was created, but most were found after. In fact, the last known Trawniki man was just deported in 2018. He was living in Queens, New York. He had lived there for more than 50 years. A judge had ordered him deported 14 years earlier, but no country would take him back. Germany said no time and time again. In 2018, the State Department and the Justice Department convinced Germany to take him back, and they finally did. He was 95 years old when he was deported. He was a Trawniki man, and he died a few months after he landed on German soil. Most of the people who were deported were not tried criminally wherever they were sent. They went on to live their lives, but they did not die in the United States. And some were tried, like John Demjanjuk, and he was convicted in Germany many years later.
Let's see if there's any other questions in this. I'm interested also in, now that this is sort of, there's been the merging of, OSI into other, war criminals, other things of this nature. Do you believe that there's a lessening of the importance of, following up on, some of the things that were related to the war crimes, and it's unfortunately that there is the international tribunal. There are other things, places, but sometimes they're focused on many things that have a political agenda other than dealing with those, because we do know that there's corporations that were involved and all sorts of things that we found over the years. Do you find that with the merging of the OSI that this is still on the radar, or not on the radar?
And part of this could just be my gut reaction in that I hope it's still on the radar. I can tell you that in the last few years, they've found and made headline for pursuing and ultimately deporting several Nazi war criminals, including this man in Tennessee just a few months ago. So I think it's still on the radar. Eli Rosenbaum is still there. Some of the historians are still there. And of course, they're backed by the Holocaust Museum and the historians there and the ADL and other groups. So I think I'm pretty sure it's still on the radar. And I certainly hope so, because can't stop now.
Other questions, if we haven't? Does OSI ever work with the Israeli government? And how did OSI find where in the US the 16 men were?
Yeah, the Israelis provided behind the scenes support for years to OSI. They weren't necessarily out in front. They didn't take back Nazi war criminals from the US. They did in a handful of cases, including John Demjanjuk, but they really didn't feel like Israel was the place to do this. It was a country of survivors, and for all kinds of reasons. They were hoping that Germany and Austria would own up to this. But Israel provided support behind the scenes for years. They were able to identify these men in the early years because of witnesses. They had witnesses that stepped forward, but memories are not quite the same as documents. And so once the communism collapsed, and all of a sudden there were so many thousands, thousands of documents in Eastern Europe, it really gave, to use Peter Black's words, a new lease on life to OSI, and they were able to bring dozens of additional cases. It's why this unit didn't stop in 1980 and 1985. It went on for more than 30 years because they suddenly had all of these documents from Moscow to Kiev to Warsaw and beyond. And that's why they were able to find as many men here as they did.
I mean, there are fascinating stories about how, Israel tracked down and brought to justice many individuals. Somebody commented that there's often in many societies, we know that in Argentina and in Brazil and in other places in Latin America, which became safe haven because of being able for people to be able to immigrate there from Europe during the war, it also became a haven and a hiding place for many people during the war.
For sure.
So let's see if there are other questions. I just want to, I just want to emphasize again that this book is just an incredible thriller, and you're a phenomenal storyteller.
Thanks.
And I have so many things highlighted. I can't remember.
Well, I can tell you that when I started working on this book, I told my mother about it. And my Jewish mother in Florida with her Jewish book club said, "Oh, not another book about the war. We've read them all. We know everything." And I said, "Mom, this is a post-Holocaust story about justice. It is a post-Holocaust story. It will leave you cheering at the end. Just give it a chance."
But I'm going to read something from the book just real quick. Just a snippet. Just as an example, this is after a train ride that a historian takes with Stutman, and Debbie writes, just before he drifted off to sleep, he decided he could have been a character in a Dr. Zhivago. How absurd this all was. The way life jerks and turns, padlocks and trains, wolves in the shadow, and mysterious men waiting at the end of the line. Mm. I mean, there's just your turn of phrase, your ability to do this. This is a remarkably beautiful book that you've written, and that's I'm not diminishing the subject matter, but you really have given color to all these people. You really do honor to Michael Bernstein, who passed away in the process of this, and really to these unsung heroes who've been doing this work for generations. And even your story about how it all began just by sort of chance, and that Peter Black convinced them that maybe historians, because he was a poor, struggling person getting his dissertation and was looking for something to do besides, I think, counting widgets or something or packing things in what was pre-Amazon days. So this was really quite remarkable. I want to remind people that you can get the book. I think we put a link in there, how you can purchase the book. And I want to tell you, this is a very readable book. It is not, there's nothing that's gruesome in that sense, whatever, but absolutely really fascinating. And it reads like a mystery novel. And the way it is, it's just amazing the way that you keep coming back and spreading the stories through this. I've read many, many books of this nature. There's also Gregory Wallinson's book, which I don't know if you've seen, but he was one of our scholars many years ago, talks about following just one cable to the Treasury Department. But it is people that don't ignore these anomalies, and the fact that these historians continually find certain things and could verify, and that the questions had different answers. And as the eyewitnesses disappeared, what they do know that the archive still existed. And what is really beautiful that you've done for us, Debbie, is you've given us a written record of the real heroes and told a story about one citizen and all that went into to track this down, and all the time and effort to bring justice. And so it gives us hope. We thank you so much. I want to thank Leslie Maitland and the Scholar Series. I want to thank Shira for running our program this evening. And we want to thank especially Debbie for giving us this opportunity. And we wish you and your family well, and hope that we all get to see each other in person in not too long of a future. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to remind you, we hope that you will join us this coming Friday night as we celebrate. The rabbis are going back into the sanctuary this coming Friday for we won't have an audience yet, but we will be doing a streaming, and we're trying out a new streaming platform. So please tune in, but it's going to be wonderful. It is the 30th anniversary of Mitzvah Day. One of the chairs, Deborah Wolf, is on, who had the great pleasure of having to do it 3 times in 1 year with Ava Shalom Lisa Spaeth. All the other chairs only had to survive 1 Mitzvah Day in a year, but they gathered and they filmed some things, and it's something we should all be very, very proud of. But more importantly, on the 18th of April, we hope you will join us for the 30th anniversary of Mitzvah Day. There are great projects. I think we're going to share the slide. There it is. You can sign up. There's PB&J making at home, where we have a pop-up you can sign up for. You can pick up in advance for fleece blanket making. You can assemble care packages for the seniors, which is a great thing that's going to be distributed. We have new book collections. And for those of you who are cleaning out your garages and have all those bicycles that nobody would take, we now have got a great system to get these bikes resurfaced and back into circulation into parts of our city where people need these desperately, simply for transportation or for enjoyment. So we hope you will join us 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. at each of our locations, and join us this Friday, the 16th, for Mitzvah Day. To our guests, to Debbie, and to the author of Citizen 865, we want to thank you so much, so much. And we have coming up, I thought this was our last one. I got one more book to read. Oh my goodness. Yosef Bashar, The Words of My Father's Love and Pain in Palestine. I'm sure it's going to be a thriller as well. It'll be 5 p.m. on the 23rd. Look forward to seeing you there. And I'll bring the wine and the cheese. Everybody have a great evening. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much, Debbie, for not only doing this, but more for giving us such a fabulous book to read.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Rabbi, and be well. Be well. Take good care.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.